Hey everybody, welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gilla, the Director of Professional Development for the Brown School here at Washington University in St. Louis. Really happy to have you with us as part of today's program. For those of you joining us here on Zoom, you probably know this by now, but this is a webinar, so we can't see or hear you. Keep eating your lunch, do whatever you're doing while we have this program. The chat feature is enabled, and want to continue to encourage the audience to interact. There's going to be some time for your questions and answers, so please feel free to share thoughts as we go through the program. I want to take a second to say hello, acknowledge, and thank my colleague Laura Peer, who's the training manager for the International Center for Child Health and Development. Laura's going to be really moderating your questions and representing your voice in this room as we move to that part of the program. Before we get started, I just want to let you know what we have coming up next week on Open Classroom. So we will have a very special early Monday program on September 20th, 9 a.m. We're going to be on with Carlotta Gall, who is a bureau chief from Istanbul for the New York Times. She was based in Afghanistan and Pakistan throughout the early first decade of the millennium and has stayed in the region and written for the Times. Great insights on the war and what's been going on lately. So an opportunity to hear from her and ask questions of someone who's very knowledgeable. We encourage you to join us for that. And then we'll be back on the next day, Tuesday, the 21st, in partnership with the Center for Mental Health Services Research. Professor Stephen Lopez is going to be joining us from USC, delivering a talk on towards reducing untreated psychosis, the case of US Latinos. So delighted to be partnering with our colleagues at CMHSR to bring that to you. Both are open. Everything on Open Classroom is free, always welcome. Please share with friends and colleagues. I'm going to put the link to our website in the chat in just a second. But now it's my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to the co-director of the International Center for Child Health and Development, Dr. Praskovia Nubunia.
Thank you so much, Janet, for hosting us. Welcome everyone from wherever you're joining us. So our colleagues from St. Louis, our colleagues from Uganda, colleagues from the West Coast are welcome, and we appreciate you for joining us on this webinar. So my name is Praskovia Nubunia. I'm a faculty here at the Brown School. I'm also one of the co-directors for ICHAD. And we are hosting this speaker series that really brings together global researchers focused on issues of child and adolescent well-being, and also discuss matters that impact their well-being and those of their families in a global setting. So before I go ahead to introduce our speaker for today, I would like to let you know some of the, our speaker lineup for the semester. This is the very first one of the year, but we also have some additional speakers that are lined up for the month of October, November, and also in the spring. So for October, we will be welcoming Professor Leila Ismailova, who is Associate Professor at the University of Chicago, Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice. She will be talking to us about her research to adapt and test which of the 3 different evidence-based approaches could best assist children reintegrating from institutions within families in Azerbaijan. So that is coming up on October 13th. And on October 10th, we have Professor Kenyan Wang, Associate Professor of Population Health in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NYU School of Medicine. She will be co-presenting with Professor Janet Nachigude, who is a lecturer and clinical psychologist at Marquette University in Uganda. So they will be talking to us about advancing scalability and the impacts of a teacher training program for promoting child mental health in Uganda primary schools. And later in the spring, we will have a lineup, but I'll just point out one, Professor Juliet Sekandis, who is an assistant professor at the University of Georgia College of Public Health. She will be presenting on her research on closest HIV health services research and mental health in Uganda. So please join us as much as you can when you have time. These are all virtual and they're around the same time, 12:30 Central Time. Join on Zoom, but also you can stream live on YouTube. Okay. So we are very, very privileged today to have Professor Caroline Lesorogol, who is a professor here at the Brown School. I'm going to read a brief of her bio because it's long and you can find it on the website. So I'm going to just touch upon a little bit. So Professor Lesorogol researches international social development to understand how dynamic social change processes affect the well-being of families and communities. Using ethnography and mixed methods, she investigates the transition from communal to private land among Samburu pastoralists in Kenya and its long-term effects on land use, cooperation, and social norms and livelihoods. Her recent work combines ethnography, household level data, and agent-based and simulation computer modeling to examine how household land use decisions affect ecological and well-being indicators. She's currently studying the formation, operation, and impact of community-based wildlife conservancies in Samburu County, Kenya. She also designs and implements capacity building community programs, including work with the Community Association in Kenya, introducing a highly productive breed of dairy goats to improve household nutrition and income. So today she's going to be talking to us about this work, and her talk is focused on conservation and community in Kenya, cost, benefits, and the prospects for change. And just so you know, at the end, Laura will be posting a link for the evaluation. So please take a moment to fill out that. It will be in our chat. Thank you and welcome, Professor Caroline.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and many thanks to Janet and Laura and Proskovia for organizing and hosting. So I will try to share my screen and make sure that we are seeing it. Are we seeing the right view? Yes. Okay, well, thank you again. It's my privilege to be able to talk to you today about ongoing but mostly completed research program on conservation and community in Kenya. I'm going to give you a bit of background about community-based conservation, what it is, where it came from, and then present a few of the findings, explain the study that we did and a few of the findings from that study, as well as some ideas that are emerging for where to go next with this work. So that's the plan. So here, I'm just giving you a sense. I'm sure that most of you are aware that biodiversity conservation is a huge global challenge. Recent headlines like those here emphasize global concern over the extinction of wildlife species due to many reasons, such as habitat loss, climate change, unsustainable use, pollution, disease, and so on. So there's a global challenge here about how to conserve biodiversity, and climate change, of course, enhances this problem. And just to point out that many unique and threatened species are in Africa, in East Africa, wildlife, including elephants, rhinos, giraffes, zebras, lions, cheetahs. You've seen most of these types of wildlife in the zoo, if not in real life. So many of them are located in East Africa, and efforts at conservation in Kenya particularly date back to the colonial period in Kenya, which was from about 1920 to 1963. And so it's been an issue and a concern in the country for many years. Ironically, the British colonial regime that initiated formal conservation efforts were also arguably responsible for much of the problem of wildlife destruction, because it was really during the colonial period when white settlers moved into Kenya and began to hunt wildlife at large scale to make room for agriculture, and then also for big game hunting and these pursuits that have kind of evolved into tourism. So biodiversity conservation and the challenges around it are a longstanding issue in the world and in Kenya. I just want to quickly go through just a very, very brief background on the history of how conservation has been approached. And this is a deep topic, but I'm just touching on it here for context. So the first types of conservation that, and the ones that may be most familiar even to Americans, is what we call sort of fortress conservation. And this is typified by, for example, the picture on the left here of Nairobi National Park, which is, a national park that's set aside only for the use of wildlife conservation. People are not allowed to live inside this park. People are not allowed to use the resources in this park. And the idea then was to kind of protect nature by separating it off from people, with the feeling that people were the problem, people were causing, competing with nature and damaging it. So this was sort of the original idea of conservation. But over the decades and through the 20th century, there's a realization that this approach is not really sufficient. And there are many reasons for that. But one main reason is that wildlife don't necessarily recognize the boundaries of parks, right? So you can set up a park and tell the giraffe, stay in this park. But if there are no fences, and there often aren't, the wildlife are going to move outside of the boundaries. And in a country like Kenya, they're going to move onto community land, and where they have been prior to the formation of the park. So the wildlife need access to greater amounts of land. And this means that wildlife and people continue to coexist even when you have a fortress conservation model. But the problem was that when parks and reserves were formed, they took resources away from neighboring communities while wildlife continued to move on to community land. And this often actually heightened the conflict between communities and wildlife. So communities that might have lived peacefully with wildlife may have come into greater conflict with them because of the separation produced by a park. So over the decades, the perspective changed to one that felt that engaging communities more proactively in conservation would be more beneficial to the wildlife, because they would not be at risk when they were on community land, and that it could also benefit communities, and that there was a need for communities to benefit in order for conservation to succeed. So there was sort of a transition from fortress conservation like the national park to community-based conservation, which is represented here by the center photo, which is the logo of one of the conservancies where we did this study. So community-based wildlife conservation then is based on a kind of win-win-win proposition. So the idea here is that if communities are involved in biodiversity conservation, or in our case, wildlife conservation, everyone will benefit. So wildlife will be protected or conserved, the green circle here, and that will be of benefit to the entire world, right? If we think of wildlife as being a kind of global public good, then protecting them benefits the globe. The orange circle here represents the benefit that governments who are hosting, this wildlife live on their land, that they will benefit from community-based conservation because it expands the scope for things like tourism, And there may also be donor funding that comes in to support conservation, so governments can benefit from that. And finally, the purple circle here represents the idea that communities that are engaged in community-based conservation would benefit from things like ecotourism on their land, and perhaps even from changes in land management that come about through the conservation project. So this is sort of the way that community-based conservation is promoted as a positive for all parties involved. But it leaves open some questions, and that leads us into the study that I'm going to talk about. So the question we had here was, there's this win-win-win proposition, but how does community conservation actually work in practice? And for northern Kenya, where this study is cited, we actually had relatively little empirical evidence about the process and the effects of community-based conservation. And if you think about it, even community-based conservation involves trade-offs. So how it usually works and how it works in the cases we're looking at today is that a community that has either ownership or rights over their land agree to set aside a certain amount of land for wildlife conservation. Now, the people that we're, the Samburu, who I'm going to introduce in the next slide, they rely on livestock for their livelihood. So if you set aside land for wildlife, then that means that that land may not be used for livestock grazing. So there are trade-offs sort of built into this system. And that raises the questions about how, for example, how is access to land within and outside the community-based conservancy or the CBC, how is that regulated? And do the people, the herders, livestock herders, understand these new kinds of rules? So this was one of our questions in the study. And this is what motivated our study was, even though, to try to find out empirically, how do conservancies actually get formed? How do they actually operate? What are the benefits and costs for the members? And what are the implications for cooperation and conflict? So the study I'm going to talk about comes after many years that I've worked and done research in this region on different issues related to land use, privatization, and change. But here's a new form of land use, so we wanted to see what the implications were. So this was a mixed methods study that we conducted between 2018 and 2019. It included ethnographic observations, in-depth interviews, household surveys, experimental games, and computer simulation modeling. And as I said, I'm just going to be presenting a small selection of results, given our time limits here. So let me introduce a little bit about Samburu County. So in the center here, you can see a map that shows, you can see Kenya on the inset, and then the map shows different conservancies that are part of this Northern Rangelands Trust, which is a large NGO that's supporting the conservancies. The conservancies where we worked are circled in red. And then around the sides, you can see some photographs that show you human settlements, what they look like in this place, sort of the semi-arid environment that's typical of this place, as well as some of the wildlife. There's a picture of the Grevy's zebra on the bottom left, who are one of the distinctive species of wildlife here. So as I said, livelihoods in this region rely heavily on livestock production and extensive livestock production. So people need to move with their livestock. You can see how dry the landscape is. This is because rainfall is rather low, but also very temporally and spatially erratic. So it doesn't always rain in the same place at the same time, and this necessitates movement to get to the resources that you need for for supporting livestock. Okay, so that's a bit of background to the study and a little bit of background to the place. So what I want to talk about here for a couple of minutes, or one of the findings of the study has to do with the CBCs, the community-based conservancies, as institutions, as land governance institutions. And one of the arguments that I'm developing in this work is this concept of institutional layering, which I think has important implications, both theoretically, but also practically for how people use land. So first of all, just a quick definition of institutions. I know that institutions in their everyday use, you think of maybe the university as an institution, or the government as an institution. Here, we're using a slightly more specific definition of institutions. You can think of them as kind of the rules, or maybe the rules of the game that people tend to follow in their lives. And these are important ways that structure social interaction. There are many different kinds of institutions. We can think about the formal rules and laws and constitutions as institutions, but also informal social norms or social conventions, ways of doing things in a community or smaller group. So there's both formal and informal social institutions, but all of them are quite important in helping to organize social life. So what we observed in studying this community-based conservancy approach was that the conservancies formed a third layer of land governance that was kind of placed on top of pre-existing institutions of governance, including at the bottom, the most historical and durable form of land management, which are the local councils of elders. So these are basically the men from any particular Samburu community who have authority over land use and who manage, for example, when I said people move around the land, often the elders will determine which areas people can use at different seasonal times, depending on resource availability. So that's the first level of institutional control or authority over land use. Then there's a middle level called the group ranch. And these were created in the 1970s, 1980s in Kenya. And they gave legal title to groups of families, registered members in particular, on particular pieces of land. So in fact, it is the group ranch that owns the land on which the community-based conservancies are formed. And so that's another institution that has a certain legal authority over land use and ownership. And then on top of that now, in the communities that have adopted conservancies, we have the community-based conservancy. And that conservancy has its own kind of set of officers who are elected, board members who are elected from the community. It has professional staff who are paid to work on the conservancy. And the priority, of course, for the conservancy is conserving land and wildlife. So what's interesting here is that all three of these institutions kind of have essentially the same, they're operating in the same community, they're operating in the same jurisdiction, the same land, and in many ways have the same responsibility. So that's why I'm calling them sort of institutional layers. But each one of them is also distinctive. So for example, the community-based conservancy is very interesting because it has, these conservancies receive quite a bit of donor funding to support their efforts. So a significant amount of resources are flowing into this institution of the conservancy. In contrast, the group branches don't have access usually to any financial resources like that, or very, very few. And the elders is a traditional or customary body that also doesn't really operate in the same way. So you have three different institutions with overlapping responsibilities, but different levels of resource and somewhat different priorities. And this has some implications. So one of the implications that we found in the study was that there were fuzzy relationships among these institutions, and that in talking to members of the conservancy, we would find quite different views about how these institutions were related and what their responsibilities would be. So these here are 4 different quotations from different members of the CBC, and you can see each one I've highlighted which institution they see as sort of primary. So the first one sees the group ranch as being the overall, having more authority than the conservancy. The second one kind of advocates that the conservancy needs to have its own committee. At this point, mostly the conservancy and group ranch committees are combined. And then the elders, the third quote, points out that the elders or the men of the community are still in charge of land. And the fourth quote says, they're all the same thing. So what we see here is really a lack of consensus among members about, these institutional relationships and responsibilities. And this situation also has some further implications that we explored that came out of our research in the communities. So for example, here are a few of the implications of this situation of layering. First, it's rather unclear which land use rules should prevail. For example, the conservancy makes very specific rules, for example, in what's called the core area of the conservancy. So conservancy may set aside 10 or 15% of the land for conservation, and livestock are not allowed in that core area, ever. They're not supposed to graze in there. And that's a rule that most community members are aware of. But when it becomes quite dry, there's a lot of pressure for people to use that land for their livestock. And traditionally among Samburu people, there's a norm that allows people to access land. And that means that you have a conflict between the CBC rule and sort of this customary norm. So even though most people report following the rules most of the time, they also break these rules. And the CBC makes the rules, but often must rely on the elders to actually enforce the rules, because elders continue to have the greatest sort of authority among most people in the communities. So there's a lack of clarity here around which rules are really enforceable, who does the enforcement, who's making the rules, how should they be followed. A second implication of this layering situation that we observed was increased competition and conflict for leadership roles. So if we look at the different layers, there's sort of different aspects of leadership that you can see. So in the traditional system of the councils of elders, they're not really competitive systems. Any adult man in the community is allowed to participate in that council. In contrast, the group ranch has just usually 3 elected officials, and they're very inactive usually because they don't have much resource. They don't have very specific jobs to do. But then the conservancies, on the other hand, are quite elaborated. They have many board positions, elected positions. They have a professional permanent staff. A lot of resources are being channeled to them. So what we saw was that there's a lot of competition growing for these CBC positions, understandably. And at the same time, this is also leading to some conflicts within the communities as there's growing suspicion about CBC leaders, managers, and how they're using the resources. So having these different layers is leading to increased competition for leadership. And finally, third, we also observed an increase in boundary making and enforcement. So as I explained, customarily, all Samburu people have access to all of the pasture within their territory. When the group ranches were formed, they do have boundaries, but those were generally not enforced. So people could continue to move in and out freely around different group ranches. But with the introduction of the conservancies, what we heard was about more policing of boundaries, especially to try to keep herders and livestock out of those protected areas. So not just the members of any particular conservancy, but also outsiders, non-members. So we often heard people complain that non-members of their conservancy were coming in and encroaching on their land. And so this is really potentially leading to quite a change in, the openness of the rangeland, which has been very important to pastoral production. All right, so I want to move on. So that's kind of those results about institutional layering really came out of the kind of ethnographic side of the study and the interviewing and observation of how the conservancies work. And I wanted to touch briefly in the last part here about benefits and costs of conservancies. And this is data that's mostly came from a random sample survey of 299. It was supposed to be 300, but we lost one. 100 households in each of our 3 conservancies, so 299. And we surveyed that people, asking them what they thought were the benefits and costs. And so I'm presenting you a few of those results here. So on this slide, you can see different benefits at different levels as people perceive them. So on the left are public goods that people perceived as benefits of the CBCs, like schools, roads, water, health, security, wildlife conservation. And then upper right is household level benefits, like did you receive a payment from the CBC? Did you sell your livestock through this NGO? Did you receive a bursary for your child to attend school? And then the lower right is individual benefits, like were you employed at the CBC, or did you earn income from an activity supported from the CBC? So you can see here very kind of different levels of endorsements of these benefits. On the public goods, security stands out as the most frequently mentioned benefit. About 62 or 3% mention that. It's interesting that the household and individual benefits are endorsed much less frequently. Only about a quarter of surveyed households identified any individual or household benefits. So this gives you a sense of the types of benefits. And then I'm going to turn in the next slide to how people understood these benefits. So for each of the benefit types, if people said, yes, I think this is a benefit, they were then asked, how is it a benefit to you, or what kind of value do you attribute to this benefit? So from those short answers, we collated them into categories. Like this example is security. So all the short answers were collated into a set of categories, and then we quantize the qualitative responses here. And so what you see are the different meanings on the left, and then how many people mentioned that meaning. And this is broken down by the 3 different conservancies where we did the study. So what's interesting here is, security. If you think about wildlife conservation, you might think that security would mean security for the wildlife, but actually what people mostly meant was security from enemies or from livestock thieves. And the reason that they attribute this benefit to the conservancy is that the conservancies hire young men to be, and a few young women now, to be wildlife scouts. And so the job of the wildlife scouts is, and they're armed with weapons, their job is supposed to be to protect the wildlife from poaching. But in fact, they also will pursue livestock thieves. If livestock is stolen from the community, they will go after those thieves. And so looking at this response, you can surmise that this is a very big benefit as people perceive it, this kind of security from enemies that people call outsiders who come to steal livestock. And even the increased peace and harmony, the second most mentioned, also has to do with that if there's less livestock theft going on across communities, that will improve peace and harmony. And then you see employment of scouts is directly connected to this idea of security. The idea that the scouts protect wildlife, which comes much further down the list in terms of the value on security. So this is the kind of analysis that we did to really try to understand how people grasp, what their interpretation is of the benefits of a conservancy. And we did that for each one, but I don't have time to share all those findings. So here I'm turning now to the costs of being a member, right? So there were some benefits that people recognized, but there are also some costs. So here are some of the costs that people mentioned, like attending meetings and loss of access to land. Those were the two most frequently mentioned. It's also interesting here that contributing funds, like contributing their own funds to support the conservancy, that was barely mentioned. And I thought that was interesting because community-based conservancies are supposed to be a community-owned organization, and yet very few people had actually contributed financially, at least, to the conservancy. They were attending meetings, though, some people. And the table on the right, again, gives you that analysis of how people explained or what they attributed to these costs. And it's rather interesting to see that the cost of attending meetings is time wasted. We can probably all relate to that, as we have to attend lots of meetings. At the same time, you see some people think that attending meetings is actually beneficial or it's a responsibility. So in fact, maybe it's not a cost for them at all. And then toward the bottom half of this table gives you some responses about the loss of access to land, which is arguably one of the most serious costs of a conservancy, is taking land out of the grazing system. And so those responses make sense: not enough grazing land, or the death of livestock, or human-wildlife conflict. So these are some of the responses. Something else just to point out here, which is interesting, is the differences across the conservancies. So I don't have time to go into that in detail, but it shows you that even in, this is one sort of community of people, broadly speaking, one ethnic group. And these conservancies, Kalama and Westgate, are actually right next to each other. But even so, you see divergences, you see different patterns, just to show that, each community is really unique in ways. And so that was another interesting finding in the study. Okay, going to move on to look at the significance of the benefits. So people named a number of benefits that they associate with the CBCs, but we also wanted to get a tangible sense, because this is the data that's really missing in the literature, is, do these conservancies really benefit people in a tangible way? Do they earn income? Or do they gain something from the conservancies? So in this table, we analyze the household data regarding income earned and employment. So either payments, receiving payments from the CBC, which is the first column here, or being employed. And so these are actual numbers in Kenya shillings, amounts of money that people reported receiving in our survey. So some of the key findings here. First, only 10% of our survey, and it was a random sample, so it's pretty representative of these communities. Only 10% reported income from a CBC, and meaning like employment income. And then only 16% reported receiving payment of any kind from the CBC, which was a little surprising because one of the CBCs reports paying an annual dividend directly to its members, but only about 20% of the members of that CBC reported receiving that payment. So the percentages of people reporting receiving payments are a relatively small proportion of the whole. And then the magnitude of those payments is shown in the two right-hand columns that show them as a percent of annual income. So we collected data on their entire income. And you can see that the conservancies are representing very small proportion of income. Employment is a little bit higher percentage, which makes sense. If someone's employed in the CBC, they're probably earning their whole income from that employment. I do want to point out that this one number, this 18%, is driven by a couple of outliers in that particular community. So if we had removed the outliers, that percentage would be lower. But even so, it's on average quite a low percentage of income. So I think from these findings, we can conclude that the benefits of CBCs, at least at household level, are quite small. And then finally, looking for these results, we wanted to see in another way how the income sources for the households, how those were divided among different activities and what role the CBCs played. So this figure shows you household wealth, which is calculated in this community as livestock holdings, as livestock are the main source of wealth. And so what we did is we ranked the households from wealthiest to least wealthy in livestock and divided them into quintiles, 20% divisions. So group 1 are the wealthiest, group 2 are the second 20%, and on down with group 5 being the least wealthy in livestock. And then the bar chart shows you what proportion of their income is coming from different sources. So what's interesting here is that the red is showing you income from livestock sales. So what this confirms is that even with wildlife conservancies, people are still heavily reliant on livestock for their well-being, for their income. And this is only livestock sales. This doesn't even include home consumption of things like milk and meat that people get from their livestock. So if anything, it's an underestimate of the contribution of livestock to family livelihood. And then the blue are the non-livestock income like wage, labor, and trade. And what we can see here is that this is also a significant and important component of income across the board, but especially for the poorer pastoralists who have few livestock. They rely more on income from wage, labor, and trade. But then and this is a pattern that we've seen in earlier studies, so it's not that surprising. But what's interesting here is the green and the orange. So those are the CBC employment and payments from the CBC, and this kind of confirms the previous slide, that you can see what a small proportion of income is contributed by the conservation activities. It's very small across the board. It is in this pooled sample, it is a bit higher for the top quintiles, suggesting that maybe wealthier people are benefiting more from conservation than poorer people. That pattern does vary across the conservancies, but in the pooled sample, this is what it looks like. So, okay, yes, okay. So to wrap up here, those are, as I said, a few of the findings from the study in terms of both the institutional structure and functioning of the CBCs, as well as the costs and benefits as understood by CBC members, and then sort of their tangible impact, at least through our measures of wealth and income at household level. So finally, I wanted to say a few words about, what are the prospects for going forward here? Now that we've done this kind of basic study of how these things function and what the costs and benefits are, what would be next steps, or what would be things that might improve the situation? So on the institutional side, I think what could be important is if communities could have a way of reconciling these institutional structures to clarify the rules, between the elders, the group branches, and the CBC, moves towards greater accountability for the CBC resources, because that question of how those resources get used came up a lot in the study. People were often suspicious about it. There were moves for demanding greater accountability about those resources. And then considering that the CBCs do have access to resources, which is, it's not a bad thing per se, but how could the CBCs be improved so that they are benefiting the communities more and perhaps being more responsive to the needs of the community? And I will say that there were, board members that we spoke to who were sensitive to this and were trying to, improve the quality of the services and benefits from the CBC. So I think there's hope that could improve. The second area has to do with the access to range resources. So as I pointed out, the CBCs seem to be leading to more fragmentation and more boundary policing than has been there historically. And this can have some really negative implications of people coming into greater conflict over access to grazing land, both within the CBCs, between the CBCs, among different ethnic communities in this region. So one thing that is needed is really a dialogue on the region about how to manage land at landscape level. And there are some organizations beginning to work on this. Another one is to really examine the mechanisms for seasonal access. So even if we're setting aside land for conservation, how do we meet the needs of livestock and wildlife in a sustainable way? And I put an asterisk there because this is a project that I'm working on with an NGO in the area to try to understand that process better and improve it. And then more effective cross-community relationships. So if we have this sort of mosaic of CBCs, how can they communicate effectively to avoid conflict? And then finally, third, I think engaging the community more to mitigate the costs, like human-wildlife conflict, which is a problem in the conservancies, especially, well, all three of them, but there was one in particular where elephants were really becoming problematic, quite dangerous. And so I think a greater application of participatory tools and engagement of the community could be helpful in coming up with strategies to mitigate those costs, and also greater support to the communities for the losses. Samburu people have lived with wildlife forever and have been pretty successful in doing that. That's why wildlife are still there, because they are willing and able to live together with wildlife. But there has to be, a balance of people's needs and their need to continue with pastoral livestock production, and also, trying to meet the needs of wildlife. So I think greater compensation to communities for the losses that they do suffer would go a long way. All right, and then
Dr. Carolyn, we do have
Yes.
a question in the chat. How were language barriers overcome?
Well, here's our research team, just to give the acknowledgements and thanks to them. Yeah, we all speak the languages, Samburu language there. So we did the research in the local language. And I think I can stop sharing now. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's keep the questions coming. This is our Q&A time. So please, if you're on the Zoom, post a question in the chat and we'll keep talking. I have a kind of next steps question. I know this is preliminary information, and is there any inkling of how these outcomes are affecting maybe like the day-to-day lives of children, or, you know, I know you're looking at household income and things like that. Is there any plans to kind of take it that like a step further?
Well, yeah, I mean, children are obviously, you know, part of families. And in fact, we did another part of the study, which wasn't in what I presented. We did collect nutrition and anthropometric data on children under 5. So we will be reporting on the situation of those children in terms of undernutrition. The early analysis shows, not surprisingly, that there's a high levels of undernutrition, stunting, and underweight, and so on. So, you know, and that's in a context where you have the conservancies already. So, so children, there are challenges for them in that. The conservancies have impacted, you know, one of the benefits that many people did cite from the conservancies was support to education, especially paying the school fees of older children, really, because primary education is free. But for secondary school and college, the conservancies have provided some money to pay for school fees. So that was a benefit that many people did associate with the conservancies. So there are, you know, there are some benefits to children, but also some risks to them, because they, like all the people here, are reliant on livestock production for livelihood. And if that is harmed, then that's not going to help them. But something else, when I was mentioning the conservancies, I think could be more beneficial to the communities. And I think that greater opportunities for young people is one of those areas that, and I think there's some awareness and interest in doing that. So hopefully a next step might be working with the conservancies to do a deeper dive into, you know, what do the communities really want to see from the conservancy.
Thank you so much. And there are some more questions coming in. The next one is, you mentioned greater compensations for livestock.
Where should
these compensations come from?
Yeah, this is a long-standing question. So there's an organization called the Kenya Wildlife Service, which is the government's government wildlife management agency, and so it's the government is supposed to provide compensation if somebody, for example, if somebody's killed or injured by a wild animal like an elephant or a lion. There is even a provision for compensation to be paid by government, but it's a highly bureaucratic process, and it really just doesn't happen. So I think, you know, for most people in this area, the expectation would still be that government would be responsible for compensation. But I think maybe there should be other models that might be considered, considering the kind of, and this I guess goes to the next one about donors, you know, the fact that donors are funding the conservancies mostly through NGOs. You know, that might be another potential source, but it's a somewhat controversial issue about compensation. Yeah. So I'm just looking at that question. Other sources of revenue. So the tourism, yeah, there is, tourism is supposed to be, you know, one of the sustainable sources of revenue. In the 3 conservancies that we studied, 2 of them do have contracts with tour operators who run very high-end eco lodges on their land, on the community's land. And so they are receiving revenues from those lodges for the land rent and also what's called a bed night fee. And so that is a source of revenue. The third conservancy doesn't have that. So they basically don't have any source of revenue aside from the donor funding. And I will say that, even those conservancies that do have tourism, of course, it was decimated by COVID, but it presumably will come back. But they're still not able to sustain their operations. I think the figure was about 80 or 90% of conservancy costs are being funded by donors. So there's still a ways to go to make these models sustainable. Although the other argument that I've heard made is, that it's not wrong to continue to have donor funding if we consider biodiversity conservation a global public good, then the global public should be paying for it. So there's, the idea that it should all be self-sustaining is perhaps questionable. Okay.
And this might need to be our last question. Should we go to the next one?
Yeah, the one on
I'll just read it out loud
Okay.
for the folks that are on YouTube on the live stream. I was curious about the household income prior to the CBC. Was there any difference to the total levels of income, positive or negative? Also curious to have a sense of the standard of living / level of poverty for the folks in the studied area.
Yeah. Oh, I don't see that comment. That must have come from somewhere else.
That was just a direct message to me. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. So is this different from household income? I don't have longitudinal data on these communities, but comparing to other similar communities where I've worked also in Samburu, their level of livestock holdings, their level of income is similar to other Samburu communities. And so the fact that the conservancies are only providing very small percentage, I think that shows us that it hasn't made that much of a difference. The situation does vary if you get really into the details. It varies across each community, but that's, I think, generally a true statement. And the other one was level of poverty. Yeah. People are living, if we take the $2 a day global standard, they're a high proportion are below that standard. Their mean is below that. So in terms of cash income, now you do have to consider that people also self-provision, especially milk, which they produce with the livestock. But yes, there are high levels of poverty here, but also inequality within the communities.
Great, thank you. Thanks to everyone who's posted questions. We're going to wrap up now. So the director of ICHAD, Dr. Fred Sowamala, just was able to join us, and I'm just going to give him an opportunity to say a final closing thought, and then you can throw it back to me, Dr. Fred, and I'll close out our talk for today.
No, I'll just say just one word that we want to thank Professor Caroline for doing this. It was extremely informative, and thank you so much for transporting us from here to Kenya, and for the work that really you are doing. It's very, very much needed. I would say that it's not out of the norm of social workers to do this kind of work, but it should really be done more and more. So thank you so much. It was extremely informative to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, Dr. Carolyn Lesorogol. Thanks, Dr. Fred. Thanks, Dr. Procy, and to Janet Gillow also for hosting us here on Open Classroom. It's been a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And we will look forward to the next talk. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us.